So hi everyone, my name is Emily Fair. I am a career counselor in the Career Center, which is in Links Connect. A little bit confusing, but I'm located in Links Connect, which is in the Tivoli Student Union. And I wanted to give you all a little bit of background on myself and how I got to this role. So I'm originally from Lexington, Kentucky, and I went to Butler University in Indianapolis for my undergrad. And I was a double major in music and psychology with a Spanish minor. So I was all over the place, did not know what I wanted to do with my life. And I joke I was in music for the money because I got a scholarship to go to college to play the cello. So I was a music major, even though I never wanted to be a musician for a living. And after I graduated, it was a journey for me to figure out what kind of job would be a good fit for me. I worked for 3 months in sales, realized I didn't like persuading people. I worked for a month as the front desk attendant at a staffing agency before being placed in a temporary position in human resources at a hospital. So I was all over the place. And finally, a year after I graduated, I told myself I need to reflect. What have I enjoyed about these experiences? What have I not enjoyed? What's been fulfilling for me? And I realized where I have felt the most excited was in college, at a university. That's always been a setting that I've loved, that has spoken to me. And the college student population has always been my favorite to work with. So it was through a lot of self-reflection that I decided to go to graduate school at CSU in Fort Collins to get my master's in career counseling. And this was my first job after I graduated. So if at any point you are also feeling a bit lost and confused as to what can I do with this major, I don't know what major to pursue, or I don't know what to do when I graduate, please come and see us in the Career Center. A lot of us have been through similar journeys, and we have lots of tools to help you explore your interests, your personality, your values, to better understand what kind of major or career would be a good fit for you. And today I'm going to be focusing on interviewing. The Career Center has done 2 workshops before with Raphael about job searching and resumes. So we figured interviewing would be a logical next presentation. So that's why I'm going to do a presentation on interviewing today. So I'm going to share my screen and bring up that presentation, and I'll leave some time for questions at the end as well. Sorry, wrong screen. Too many screens up right now. There we go. So as questions come up, please feel free to put them in the chat or unmute yourselves and share out, as well as this is being recorded. So if you feel more comfortable putting comments in the chat, please feel free to do so. But I'd really love to hear your insight. A lot of my presentations are interactive, so I'm hoping to hear from you all today as I go through. So an overview of this presentation, starting with reflecting on a past interview we've had, and then focusing on how to prepare for an interview, things to do in advance, tips and strategies for during the interview, how to answer questions, what kind of questions to expect, and how to prepare questions for the interviewer. And then I'll talk a little bit about steps after the interview and share a resource that we have for you to practice interviewing as well. So first, just want to start off with an opportunity to reflect. If you could unmute or put in the chat an answer to any of these questions. But if you have had an interview before, how was it for you? What was most challenging? Or what's some advice that you would give yourself reflecting back on that experience? So I'll give you about a minute or two to go ahead and put answers to any of those questions in the chat. All right, so I saw one person said they did well talking about their abilities and strengths. That's absolutely something you want to do before the interview, is be prepared to talk about your abilities, your experiences, your skills, things you do well, things you can bring to the position, and strengths that you can contribute as well. I'd love to hear from one more person. Again, no right or wrong answers here, and I won't share your name in the recording. All right, so one person said it was challenging to add enough details without rambling and adding unnecessary information. I hear that a lot when I meet with students to help prepare them for interviews. Rambling is a very common difficulty and concern that students have. Some suggestions I would have is to always end your response by tying the question back in. So saying something like, in conclusion, that's the greatest challenge that I've ever faced. Or in summary, that was a time that I showcased one of my strengths and was successful in my role. So reiterating the question can help with that, as well as keep an eye on the time too. I'd say when the person says we'll have half an hour for 10 questions or 45 minutes for 10 questions, think to yourself, okay, so that should be, this kind of certain minutes per question. So I should keep myself on track. Someone else said it's painful to look back on their interview experience. Anxiety played a big role, it sounds like, in that interview experience being challenging for you. Anxiety is very common. Interviews are stress-inducing. There's no way to sugarcoat that. And we'll talk a bit about a few ways to deal with anxiety today, as well as I encourage you to reflect on what's worked for you as well. Everyone's a little bit different. Sometimes reducing anxiety can be as simple as going outside and getting some fresh air. Sometimes it's watching a YouTube video to take your mind off of the interview about, 20 minutes beforehand, just to distract your mind. Talking to a friend or a roommate, getting something to eat. So it looks a bit different for every person, but anxiety is very common. And sometimes it takes time to reflect on how to overcome that. Someone else said their advice they would give themselves is to not be so nervous. The more relaxed, the better. And yes, I completely agree. The more relaxed you are for the interview, the better you'll do. I know that's easier said than done, than just like, oh, just relax, you'll be fine. So we'll talk about some of those strategies today. But the more relaxed you are, the better you tend to do as well, because you tend to talk more clearly and more slowly, and your personality comes across more the more relaxed you are. Great, thank you all for sharing, I appreciate it. So when we think about preparing for an interview, one of the most important things to do in advance is knowing yourself and reflecting on yourself, because they're going to be asking you a lot of questions about yourself. So consider things like your skills, things that you value that are important to you, maybe some of your greatest accomplishments or challenges that you've overcome. These are all pretty common questions that come up in some form in interviews. So it takes some time to reflect on some of those things before a couple days, if not a week or so before the interview. Also reflect on your strengths and weaknesses. Those are also very common questions in an interview. Tell us about your 3 greatest strengths, or what is your weakness and how are you overcoming it? And again, it takes time just to think about these things. You can't prepare for every single question they're going to ask in an interview because we don't know what they're going to ask. But these are some of the more common ones that I'd encourage you just to reflect on, so you have some examples or experiences you could share if you're asked about them. And for the weakness question, always be sure to talk about how you're improving upon your weakness or overcoming it. So never just say, oh, I have really bad time management. Next question, because that's not going to look very good. But instead share, this is a challenge that I've recognized in myself. I tend to turn things in like right on the deadline or a few minutes past. And so I've learned that if I can set alarms on my phone, so it'll go off, an hour before something's due or a half hour before, it'll help keep me on track. And I'm trying to apply that same strategy to my professional and work life as well and test out different things. One of the biggest pieces of advice I could give you to prepare for an interview is having almost a goodie bag of experiences to share so that those experiences could address almost any skill they ask for. So when I was first interviewing for jobs after I graduated from undergrad, I thought to myself, what are some of my biggest experiences in undergrad? I was a student ambassador, so a tour guide. I studied abroad one semester, and I taught cello lessons. I'm like, those are my big three. So if I get asked questions about public speaking or administration or my organizational skills or time management, I'm like, my tour guide job, I can use that to answer like almost any kind of administrative skill they'll ask for. If they asked for any kind of personable skill like customer service or meeting someone's needs, my cello teaching job, I can answer like any kinds of questions around those kind of things with that one. So I'd say reflect on like 3 to 5 experiences, could be from your time in college or outside your time in college, jobs or internships you've had. So that way you have those experiences ready to go to answer almost any question you'll be asked. And I want you to remember, it doesn't have to be from school or work. It could be volunteering. It can even be from your personal life. I met with a student who was preparing for an interview for graduate school. And she wanted to talk about a time where she helped tutor her younger siblings. She wasn't paid, it was just for fun, but she was helping her younger siblings at home with their homework and talked about that in the grad school interview in terms of her ability to teach and counsel people. And then another big piece of advice before the interview is to practice. There's not a specific length of time answers have to be. Some are shorter than others, some are longer than others. But the more you practice, the more you tend to feel comfortable. So before an interview, a couple days in advance, I'd recommend practicing with a family member, a partner, or a roommate, so you can get more comfortable. Another big piece that you want to know before the interview is knowing the position you're applying for and the employer, the company. So definitely reread the job description. Job descriptions tend to have a list of requirements or skills that they're looking for, and that's probably what they're going to ask questions about. So if the job you're applying for says, we really need someone who's a team player, and you're seeing like teamwork come up in a lot of bullet points, be prepared to talk about your experiences working in a team. It's almost like a cheat sheet for questions that you'll probably be asked. And definitely research the organization in advance. You can do this by going to their website, going to their LinkedIn page, reading about like current events by Google searching them or looking at articles posted on their website. You could also talk to someone who works at the company. I wouldn't do that if you've already applied and you're just trying to like, hey, pick me. I just want to network and I just want to connect. But even before a job opens up at a company, you could do an informational interview with someone who works there. And I could talk for a long time about informational interviews. Not going to do it now, but I highly recommend doing an informational interview, talking to someone who works at a company, if it's a company that you're interested in working at in the future. And also research who's on the interview committee. Look them up on Indeed, look them up on the company's website, Google search them. So you're aware of what their positions are and their background is. And that can be helpful just to make you less nervous as well when you know who's interviewing you and where they've come from. You don't necessarily have to gather all of these key facts. These are just an idea of some of the things you should be looking for before the interview. What kind of products does the company put out? Definitely look at their mission and values. So in the interview, you can say how your mission and values align with theirs. Is this a very small nonprofit that only has like a team of 5 people? Or is this a global organization that's looking to expand in the next few years? Be aware of things like that. And this information is really helpful when creating questions to ask after the interview, because almost every employer will say, well, that wraps up all the questions we have for you. What questions do you have for us? And you definitely want to have some ready to go. I'll talk a little about that in a bit too. But you want to articulate why you want to work there and ask questions that show you've done your research. So by looking on the company's websites or researching who it is that's interviewing you, it helps prepare you to ask them questions. Saying something like, yeah, I noticed on your website, you posted this really cool article about this new software you're trying. Can you tell me more about that? Or turning to a person on the interview committee and saying, I looked you up on LinkedIn just because I was curious about your background and I'm fascinated how you transitioned to this role from your previous one. I was wondering what drew you towards this role and your interest in this company. Something, again, that shows you've done your research. So here's that slide that I mentioned, feeling anxious about interviewing. I heard that come up a lot for you at the beginning, feeling nervous, feeling anxious, and how you want to be relaxed, but it can be challenging at times. So I wanted to share some tips, some things to think about that might help with that. So one thing to consider is that you have power in this interview. The people on the other side of that interview, whether we're talking about over Zoom or in person, it is a lot of work to get you to that spot. They invest a lot of time and a lot of money to look through all of those resumes, to do phone screens, to do a first round interview, maybe a second round interview. So they put a lot of time into you and they're really hoping you're going to do a good job because they want to hire someone. I've been on a hiring committee before where the search has failed, where we did final round of interviews and we're like, ugh, no one was as good as we wanted them to be. We didn't find anyone who exactly encapsulated our vision as much as we wanted. And it's disappointing and it's frustrating because they want to fill that role. They put a lot of work into getting you there. So they're really rooting for you and they want you to do well because they want to hire you for that position. Also keep in mind, it is a two-way street. You have the ability at any point during the application process to withdraw, to say, you know, I don't want to do this interview, or actually I've taken another position. And that's always on the back of their mind too, that they're crossing their fingers that you're going to do well and accept the position. They don't want to fail the search. So you have a lot of power in deciding if this is a position that you want to take and if this is a company you want to work for. And even when thinking about questions to ask the employer at the end of the interview, think about, how will I know if this is a good fit for me? Because you get to decide in the end, even if they offer you the position, if you want to take it or not. And I want to give you all a moment to share out in the chat again, because I'd love to hear what strategies you have found to be successful in reducing anxiety. And again, I just gave you things to think about, but maybe some strategies you found are having a cup of tea, going for a walk. I know I mentioned like watching a YouTube video. A deep breathing exercise can sometimes be really helpful. So I'm going to give you a minute or two to go ahead and share out in the chat, what are some strategies that have worked for you or you would like to try? Someone said exercise. That's a great one. Yeah, exercise releases those endorphins, helps us work out those jitters so our body's more relaxed just from being tired from working out. So yeah, maybe going for a run or lifting weights, whatever it is, exercise looks for you. Someone said, I'd like to try writing or journaling in preparation for an interview. Absolutely. I would recommend, especially for questions that are really common, like strengths and weaknesses, challenges you had to overcome, times you had to work as a team, things like that are really common. Feel free to jot down on, type out or on a piece of paper, just a few notes for yourself, like, oh, this is an experience I could use, or here's some things I want to mention. I wouldn't recommend writing out whole paragraphs, like word for word responses, because I've noticed students who try to do that, try to memorize them. And then in the interview, like, oh, I can't remember the script that I wrote for myself. And they come across as more robotic or more stressed. So I'd say writing, like jotting down a few notes or bullet points is an excellent way to prepare. or even just journaling to reflect, like writing down your feeling. I feel really stressed right now. I'm worried about this interview. It's really important to me. Just getting those emotions out. Someone else mentioned stretching. Great idea. I should actually try that because I feel like my legs are tight all the time from sitting in these chairs for Zoom meetings. So I might take that suggestion. Someone else said, reminding myself that if the interview does not go well, it's not the end of the world. It's a great point. There are millions of jobs out there and companies are always hiring. So even if you don't land the position that you necessarily wanted, there's other positions out there, which the Career Center, we're happy to help you job search and prepare for future interviews. And sometimes it's helpful to remind yourself that this could be a practice. You know, like you did this interview, it didn't go as well as you wanted, but that's okay, because it means you're more prepared for interviews in the future. You're more comfortable with them now, you know what to expect. Sometimes even recommend if you apply to a company that's like a backup option that you're not really excited about, but they give you an interview, I'd say still take it just to practice, because who cares if you don't do well, you know, it's not the end of the world. Someone else said, keeping in mind that I'm also evaluating the employer and deciding if I want to work for them. Absolutely, that's a great point. Like I said, you have power in this interview. It's a two-way street. It's your choice. If you go into that interview and you're like, wow, I don't like the vibes here, the culture is kind of off, I don't think this is where I want to be, you can say no at any point. You have no obligation to accept the position if they offer it to you. That's why I really encourage you to think of questions to ask the employer that's going to help you decide if it's going to be a good fit or not. Yeah, excellent strategies. Thank you all for sharing. I really appreciate it. So I am not going to read this slide. I know there's a lot on here, but I just wanted to give you a chance to kind of just scan through these and recognize that there's differences between phone interviews, virtual interviews, and in-person interviews. The content of all of them will be pretty similar, but they might look different. So again, moment to share out. I want you all to look at this chart here and put in anything in the chat that jumps out at you. Like, oh, I hadn't thought of that. Or this is a really good point. Something that's popping for you. Sorry. So one person shared they like the advice to dress as though even a virtual interview was a real interview, just because wearing professional interview attire can affect how you present yourself and impact your mood as well. I don't think a lot of companies do this, but I did hear from one student who said they were in a Zoom interview and the employer said, we want you to stand up so they could see what kind of pants they were wearing. And I was like, that's a little alarming. I've never heard of that before. It's just that one time. But I was like, wow, if that's a thing companies are doing, better safe than sorry, you know, to wear full professional attire. And someone else said, eye contact. Yeah, eye contact over Zoom is a little bit different than in person, because on Zoom or Google Meets or whatever platform they're using, you have squares on the screen, so your eyes might be moving a little bit. And that's okay. If you're not looking exactly at the camera, like this is me looking at the camera, this is me looking at your questions. There's a slight difference, but it's not so drastic that I would stress about always staring at the camera. I feel it's a lot easier if you're looking at a person's face. So I think it's appropriate to look around at their faces on the screen. And someone else says, I forget to smile sometimes because they get nervous. That's very common. It's harder to be yourself and to smile if you're being interrogated for an important job. But I'd say, yeah, smile as much as you can, even over the phone. Smiling comes through, like the person on the other end can hear the smile in your voice. And over Zoom and in person, it also just shows that you'd be friendly to work with. So think of it not as just a way to calm you down, but if people are interviewing you and see you smile, they'll think, oh, well, this is a friendly person. I'd like to work with them. So it almost gives you a leg up in the interview. All right, so moving on into during the interview. So there's a couple different types of questions that you could be asked in the interview. If you Google search types of interview questions, every single website will have a different list. Some will be like, there's 3 types of interview questions. Some will be like, there's 7 types of interview questions, because every interview question is different and it depends on how you categorize them. I basically break them down into 3 main categories. One are behavioral questions, which focus on how you behaved in the past, because it's indicative of how you'll behave in the future. So examples of these types of questions would be, give me an example of when, or describe a situation in which, because they want to see how you handled it before. And then there's also future-oriented questions where they present you with a situation. So here's some examples. Say you are working on a group project with your coworkers and have a disagreement. How would you handle this? Or what would you do if you were asked to perform a task you had never done before? So not necessarily asking you to draw upon past experiences, but they want to hear your thought processes. There's not necessarily a right answer to these types of questions, but the more detailed you are, the more you show that you critical think and you problem solve, the better off you become. So again, not necessarily a right answer, but showing that you have the skills needed to think through these questions and think through situations before taking action. And then there's also open-ended questions. The most common open-ended question ever is, tell me about yourself. That is by far the most common question in an interview, and it's almost always asked at the beginning. Or it could be something like, what is your greatest accomplishment? I was actually asked in my interview for this job, if you were a chip, what kind of chip would you be? Which was very different. I don't think that's a common question. But again, they want to see, the people interviewing me wanted to see, my critical thinking skills, as well as some of my creativity, and providing why I picked my response. I actually said chocolate chip, which really threw them for a loop because they were all expecting some kind of like potato chip. So I secretly think that's why I got this job, but who knows? So then when answering questions, I want you to keep in mind that your answers can draw from many different experiences. Don't feel that maybe you're applying for a job and your major is different than the job, and the only experience you have that's directly related to the job is maybe volunteering that you did. It's okay if you draw from experiences in your classwork or your major, even if it's not directly related to the job. Your answers can draw from different jobs that you've had, activities you've done, organizations you've been in, pretty much anything that shows your skills. It doesn't have to be a professional experience. It could be personal. So don't feel like you're limited in terms of experiences you can draw your answers from. And if you don't have an example, it's okay to share something similar. I've heard a lot of students who have run into this issue where they're like, oh, they asked me about a time when I had a conflict with an employee. And I'm not a conflict person. Like, I can't think about a time I've argued with someone. Then I would say, maybe have you ever argued with or had a disagreement with like your siblings or your parents? Because that could work. And even if you can't think of anything, don't just say, oh, I've got no answer. But I would instead say, I really can't think of anything at the moment, but here's how I would handle it if it did come up. So handle it in a situational way. You can always pause if you need. That's another thing that can help reduce stress or anxiety in the interview, is just pause to take a breath before you respond. They don't expect you to respond to every single question immediately. There's been many times in interviews where I said, wow, that's a really tough question. Give me a moment to think about my response so I can give you the best response that I can. And then I'll kind of look down, think for a moment, say, okay, so I thought of this example that I think would work. And that's totally okay. It's better to pause and deliver a strong answer than try to rush into a response that you haven't thought about and you kind of stumble through it or start rambling. So give yourself space to pause if you need, and you can always ask them to repeat a question as well. Keep an eye on the time. Sometimes interviews are secretly looking at your time management skills. If they say we've got 10 questions in 45 minutes, and we want to make sure you have time for questions at the end too. So here we go. So maybe thinking like, oh, 10 questions, 45 minutes. So maybe around like the 20-minute mark, I better be at question 5. Otherwise, I need to make my answers shorter. So keeping an eye on the time can also show your professionalism and time management skills. A couple don'ts. Don't speak negatively about a previous employer. So even if you had a very challenging experience at your last job, and maybe that's why you're looking for a new one, I wouldn't say like, oh, my coworkers were so frustrating. My manager was so difficult. Like I couldn't work in that environment anymore. Because that can kind of be a red flag for the new employer that, oh, I wonder if it was the employer, if it was actually this person, maybe this person was difficult to work with. So instead I would phrase difficult situations as, it wasn't the best cultural fit for me. I realized I was more looking for an experience in which I could work with people or had more opportunities for professional development. And I wasn't fitting as well into that culture because they didn't value those same things. And I recognize that your company places really strong value on these opportunities, which is why I'm so drawn to work in this role. Also, don't ask about salary or benefits during the interview. That is an appropriate question after they've offered you the position. And you could even negotiate your salary after they offer you the job, but you don't want to ask that in the interview because it can come across as though that's your only reason for applying to this job. Like it's just the salary, you're just looking for a job, you just really need something with good benefits. So if those things are a big deciding factor for you, and you're like, I don't even want to do an interview if I don't know what my salary and benefits will be, I'd recommend contacting human resources or a recruiter before the interview to ask those questions. So that way you're not asking your supervisor who you would be working with. And then you all have mentioned this already, but trying to be yourself as much as possible. If you are your authentic self in the interview and you don't get the job, then that probably means that that company is not a good fit for you. So keep that in mind too. If you were like, I was totally myself, I put my 100% of myself into that interview, I did well, then there's a different reason, why they didn't pick you. And it's probably because your values didn't align with theirs or your personality wasn't a good fit. And you would probably not enjoy working there anyway. And then I would be a bad career counselor if I didn't mention the STAR method in the interview presentation. Show of hands for those in attendance. Have any of you heard of the STAR method before? And you could just use that hand icon. Okay, seeing one hand. Okay, might be new to some people. This is a very well-known technique for interviewing. And the S stands for situation. And you would use this whenever for behavioral questions. So whenever they say, tell us about a time when, or describe a time when, this is kind of the formula that a strong answer follows. I wouldn't necessarily memorize this and be like, oh, I didn't do the T, I didn't do the T in my answer. But just use it more of a guide to make sure you're answering all aspects of behavioral questions. So the S stands for situation, setting the scene. task would be to describe your responsibilities within this scene. So going back to my tour guide example, maybe they asked me about a time I had to answer a question I didn't know the answer to. So I'd say situation, I was a junior in college working in the Office of Admissions, and a student and a parent came up to me to ask about the requirements to get into the business school. The tasks, my responsibilities. As a student ambassador, I was there to answer their questions and I wanted to be a helpful resource for them. And part of my job was to, answer questions from students and parents. So then I would talk about actions, some steps I would take. So I didn't know the answer and I was honest with them. I think it's really important to be honest with people, especially if they are trying to get a feel for what a university is like. You don't want to give them false information. So I told them I wasn't 100% sure, but I did have someone possibly upstairs who I could go ask to check with them, who works in the business school. And if that person wasn't able to answer, I'd be happy to look the information up online to get them the answer. And even if we couldn't find it online, I could give them the email of an admission counselor for the business school who would know for sure. And they were very appreciative of all those options. The person I hoped was upstairs wasn't there. Couldn't find it online. So I gave them the email of the business admissions counselor and thanked them for their patience and asked if they had any other questions as well. So good customer service in essence. And then the result. So always share the result. This is an important part of behavioral questions that a lot of students forget. But the result was that they really appreciated the efforts that I made. And they also talked to me more about my experience as a student, which they may not have done if I had not worked so hard to answer that question for them. And it also made me feel more comfortable on how to answer those questions in the future. I learned maybe I shouldn't try to run upstairs because it felt a little awkward to leave them waiting in the lobby. So that reflecting back, I think I would do that differently next time. So sharing your outcomes and what you learned. Does anyone have any questions about this method? All right, so again, don't feel like you have to necessarily do the S, do the T, do the AMR. But if you are someone who struggles perhaps with rambling or just explaining a storytelling, maybe storytelling is really difficult for you, this is a great formula for storytelling. All right, so nearing the end of the interview, the interviewer will probably ask, do you have any questions for us? This is very common. And you definitely want to have questions prepared because, as you all have said, you are interviewing them just as much as they are interviewing you. And you want to figure out how will you know if this company is a good fit for you. And that will probably involve some self-reflection, not necessarily something we're going to think about today. But when you do interview, think like, what's a make it or break it for you in a position? I prepare around 3 to 5 questions. Odds are you will not have time to ask them 5 questions, but especially if you get nervous or anxious easily, why not have more? So that way you have more to ask, just in case you do have a lot of extra time. And also rank them in order of priority too. So thinking like, what's the number one thing I really got to ask, and make that be your number one question. Here's some examples. I would make your examples, your questions specific to the company as much as you can, which is why it's helpful to research them in advance. So maybe if they've expanded to 2 new locations, saying you've noticed that, and how do they view this expansion continuing in the future? Something you noticed on their website and asking for more information about it. There's also some questions you can ask that are generic. So if you Google search questions to ask at the end of an interview, what are some challenges currently facing this position? That's a common one. As well as maybe you want to know about professional development opportunities. Maybe learning is something you're really passionate about and you want a chance to learn and grow in a role. So again, I wouldn't necessarily use these, but more use them for inspiration. Like, what are some questions I really want to ask that I really want to know? All right. So then after the interview, be sure you don't leave the interview before knowing what next steps are. Commonly, they'll tell you that. So before the end of the interview, they say, well, thank you for your time. We really appreciated you coming in. And we'll get back to you before the end of the week if you've made it to the second round. Or maybe they'll say, we'll get back to you. Even if you don't make it to the second round, we'll keep you updated. Or say, we'll let you know if you got the position before the end of the month. Typically, they'll say that. If they don't, feel free to ask. It's totally appropriate before you leave the interview to say, thank you so much for your time. I was just curious what next steps would be or what I should expect in the coming weeks. That's a very appropriate question to ask. And then definitely send a thank you email. I cannot stress that enough. It doesn't have to be a handwritten letter. Almost no one does that anymore. But do send them an email thanking them for interviewing you. If you have the names of everyone who interviewed you in their emails, that's best. But even if you only have the name and email of one of the people, that's also very helpful to have. And in that email, you want to keep it brief, keep it pretty concise, and just reiterate your qualifications and your excitement for the position. So saying like, thank you so much for taking the time to interview me on November 11th. I don't know why I picked that date. Thank you so much for that opportunity. I'm very excited to learn more about your company and apply my 5 years experience in customer service to working with your clientele. I look forward to hearing from you and hope you have a wonderful rest of your week. Something like that. So again, nothing long, concise, but if that thank you email shows, for one, you've taken a step further than probably a lot of applicants have done. A lot of applicants don't send thank yous after interviews. So it just shows, again, your professionalism and your interest in the position. And it also reminds the employers about you. So in case they, maybe they had a lot of people that they interviewed, but they'll be like, oh yeah, this person, they sent us a thank you letter just, 2 days ago. And I forgot that they had 5 years of customer service experience. So it can be a reminder as well to keep you present in their thoughts. All right. So nearing the end of my PowerPoint here, I just wanted to share how you can schedule an appointment with the Career Center, because we are always happy to help prepare you for interviews or do mock interviews with you. So you can log into Handshake and then click the Career Center. You can schedule appointments with us by clicking appointments. And we also have resources to help you prepare for interviews under this resources option. So after clicking resources, then you want to click interview preparation. We have a PDF there of strategies to prepare and do well in interviews that covers a lot of the same things that I said today. And we also have a link to Big Interview. Big Interview is a website that we actually pay for in the Career Center so that you don't have to pay for it. It's free for you to use as a student. You just have to use this access code in order to create an account, so that way you don't have to pay. And it's an awesome tool. It's has artificial intelligence of people who will ask you questions, and you can pick, I want to be asked questions related to accounting, or I want to be asked questions related to leadership. You can pick the topic or the industry, and the fake person will ask you the question, and then you can record yourself responding and play it back. So you can hear how you sound, see how you look, if your background's looking good or if your lighting is bad, and just practice being asked those questions spur of the moment. It's really helpful. All right. And then I just want to give you the opportunity, to let you know where the Career Center is located. We are in the Tivoli Student Union. We're not in the main Tivoli. It's a little confusing to find us. We're located through a courtyard. So if you go out to the courtyard by iPie or the brewery, and then re-enter the Tivoli into Links Connect, that's where we're located. And you can schedule appointments with us through Handshake, like I just showed you, or in person or over the phone as well. Or you can email me. I'm always happy to talk with you over email too. All right, and then I just want to use our remaining time to answer any questions you have, because I know I've been talking a lot. And I would love to hear what questions this presentation has prompted for you, or even if you have an upcoming interview and have concerns about it. Happy to talk through those. I'll start with a question that I see in the chat. Any recommendations for interviewing at a place that you know well, are well connected with, and know the people you're being interviewed by? Like any recommendations for finding a place like that?
No, like how to interview, like we'll probably have an interview set up at a place that I'm already well connected with.
Oh, nice.
And I'm curious, like, I don't know, I feel like the way I interview might differ because I already really know them, and just how to highlight that and my already established connections with them without, I don't know, sounding awkward.
Got it. Okay, so you're interviewing a place you're already very comfortable with, and you know the people who work there. Yeah, that's a good question. That happens a lot, especially once you get into an organization or a setting you really like. For instance, if you love higher education, people move around within higher education all the time. And so a lot of times they know people who are on the interview committee asking them the questions. My main recommendation would be to still prepare for it as though you were not comfortable with it, as though this was a brand new company, as though you didn't know who's on the other side of the Zoom room or the table, because you still want to do your best. So I would still do research in terms of like, where is this company going? What's currently posted on our website? Thinking about strategies you would use going forward if they hired you for that role. So thinking in advance as well. So treat it just like any other interview, as if you didn't know them. Because I found what often happens is when people are interviewing with friends or close companions, they don't prepare because they're like, oh, well, of course I'll get the job. They know me, they know my work ethic. And then someone actually interviews better than them, who is from an external candidate. That happens pretty frequently. And sometimes the people interviewing are conflicted because they're like, wow, you know, like we know this person, we know they know the company, like they'd be an easy hire, but they really didn't interview or answer questions as well as this external candidate. And it becomes challenging for them. So that would be my biggest recommendation, is to still prepare as though you didn't know the company. So you can do your best interviewing. I noticed someone else said, I had no idea follow-up thank you emails were a thing. Yeah, that's something you don't really learn in school. They don't even teach you how to interview in school at all. But yeah, it's definitely a thing I would encourage. It's not something you have to do to land the role. Plenty of people get a job without sending a thank you email, but it's just going above and beyond. It just adds another touch in terms of your excitement and interest in the company. So it never works against you. It's never a bad thing to send a thank you email. Yeah, these are great questions and comments. Anything else that people are worried about, thinking about? All right, well, I don't want to keep you later than you need to. Rafael, anything you would like to share or announce?
No, that's it. Just thank you so much. Fantastic as usual. We really, really appreciate you doing this for us and for all future generations with this recording. And it is extremely useful. And it has been already commented the previous two presentations you did, how it has helped people. So thank you so much, Emily, for taking the time. And whenever you have a chance, if you can send us the slides and the link to the recording, that would be fantastic.
Absolutely.